a sleepless friend, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
So, I'm delighted to be speaking to Jonathan Mountstevens, a history teacher and deputy head at Beaumont School in St Albans, about how the subject of history is being dragged into culture wars. And Jonathan, you put up on Twitter in the week a really interesting and well thought through series of tweets about just what's bugging you. Could you give us a bit of an overview of your irritation?
Yeah, I'm sure. Nice to talk to you, David. This sort of has been bugging me for some time, I think, and there's been a combination, a number of things that have irritated me. And the specific thing this week, which kind of prompted the thread, was a letter sent by a group of Conservative MPs called, I think, the Common Sense Group, to the Daily Telegraph about a piece of research conducted by the National Trust, looking into the sort of links between some of their properties and slavery and colonialism. And for example, they showed that there were some links with Chartwell, for example. And one of the things that these MPs seemed to object to was that they felt that this research was kind of tarnishing the reputation of kind of national heroes like Winston Churchill, who obviously lived at Chartwell himself. And that kind of uncovering this stuff about its history sort of did damage to him as a national hero. And I think one of the things they said in this letter was that the National Trust was being coloured by cultural Marxist dogma. And I just don't think that the research that they conducted, I can't say whether the National Trust is coloured by cultural Marxist dogma. I'm not here to speak for the National Trust. Yeah. But it seemed to me entirely wrong-headed for them to be saying that this piece of historical research meant that. Simply because, for me, there's two questions there. And the first question is it reasonable for the National Trust to conduct historical research into the properties which it has in its portfolio? And the answer to that seems to me, yes. That seems to be entirely appropriate and part of its remit. And obviously, it presents findings from that historical research in the form of guidebooks and maps and human guides who will provide information at those properties, and that for me enriches the experience of visiting some of them. So it seems to me that it is completely appropriate for it to be doing that research. And secondly, the other important question is, were the findings of that research accurate? And it doesn't seem to me that anybody is disputing that these properties did indeed have links with slavery and colonialism. So to me, then, I couldn't see what the problem was with this particular piece of research. So why suppress it? And it did very much seem to me that that's what these MPs were keen to do, to suppress some historical research and say that it should never have been done, it should never have been published. And what I thought was particularly ironic is they were accusing in that letter the National Trust of sanitising history. And it just seemed to me that they were the ones sanitising history. They were doing completely the opposite, because they were essentially saying that these aspects of our past, we don't like them. They don't suit us. They're uncomfortable. They don't promote the kind of we want. Sorry?
They're unsanitary.
Absolutely, they're unsanitary. We need to sort of cleanse them. And it seemed to me that that therefore that accusation really should have been directed at themselves. And it's that specific event that prompted my thread. I guess the question then is, since I don't work for the National Trust or speak for the National Trust, I am a member and I like National Trust properties, but why did that bother me so much? I suppose that's what I'm a history teacher. And as a history teacher, what interests me, I'm passionate about young people learning about the past in all its complexity. So it seems to me that kind of when people try to suppress historical research because they don't like its findings, that is a threat to public knowledge of history, and therefore that's a threat to my profession, and I'm just not prepared to stand for that. So I suppose that's where the thread came from.
Right. Oh, we got a bit of echo there. Sorry, it's better now. One of the people that you cite in your sort of argument is another MP, Simon Clarke, who said we should recognise that the United Kingdom has been an overwhelming force for good in the world. Hating ourselves and our past is enfeebling in the face of those who would believe in a darker and dystopian future if the West retreats into introspection. Is he? What's your problem with that sentiment, Jonathan?
Sure. I mean, that tweet came, if I remember rightly, from a kind of thread of tweets that he had posted. And I think it's interesting, I haven't got them in front of me now, but it's interesting to kind of look at them in sequence, because that, I think, is some way down the sequence. And earlier on, I thought he'd been making some, quite interesting points essentially about history and being ahistorical, and arguing that actually history is something which is really quite complex, and that it doesn't necessarily kind of fit our neat preconceptions of what it should be. Well, I'd agree with him about that. But then all of a sudden he seemed to switch in this particular tweet to saying we should all argue that Britain's been an overwhelming force for good in the world, and that seemed to contradict what he'd been saying previously, which is that history is complex and messy and doesn't neatly get put into boxes. I completely disagree. I don't think we can conclude from history that Britain has overwhelmingly been a force for good in the world, and I don't think that makes me a Britain hater or anti-British to say that. I think it's about nuance and subtlety, and it seemed to me that he's ignoring all of that, and it's not his job to tell me what conclusions I should come to from studying history, and even more dangerously, if this is what he was suggesting, nor is it my job as a history teacher to tell my students that Britain has overwhelmingly been a force for good in the world.
No, and you go on to say, you went on to say the damage that it causes if they throw enough accusations that those who disagree with them are woke, Britain-hating, PC members of a liberal elite. They turn what should be a truth-seeking discipline into a mud-wrestling match. With the aim being who can toss around the best insults. So we've got there, in this particular thread, a couple of Conservative MPs obviously making this kind of argument. Do you think this is something that people on the other side of the political divide are also in danger of?
I think probably yes.
Sorry, Jonathan. I think particularly in the States, the New York Times and their 1619 curriculum, which has come under quite a bit of criticism for being factually inaccurate.
Yeah, and I think, much as what is sort of affecting my life at the moment and bothering me at this sort of particular point of time tends to be coming from the right, with kind of, government guidance about, political impartiality and all these kind of things. So my specific criticisms in that thread were, as you say, directed at a couple of Conservative MPs and at this sort of wider common sense group of Tory MPs who are making these cases. I think it is important to be consistent. And I think it's equally unacceptable for people on the left to kind of dictate what the conclusions of history need to be, and it would be equally unacceptable for them to say certain aspects of history shouldn't be studied or certain findings from history shouldn't be published. I'm not at this precise moment in time aware of people on the left who are saying things should be suppressed or things shouldn't be studied, but I would make the same criticism of them. And with regard to the 1619 project, I don't know a huge amount about it. But from what I do know, it seems to me that it did come in for a lot of criticism from historians for essentially distorting the factual material and coming up with something which perhaps was not a completely honest take on the past, and I don't think that's acceptable either. It's not just wrong when the right does it; it's wrong when the left does similar things.
So history's above politics. There's something there's something that needs to be purer and held sacrosanct about the discipline. Is that part of your position, Jonathan?
I think it might be an unsustainable position if I tried to say that. I mean, what does politics mean apart from anything else if we're going to say that? And obviously, there's party politics, what we tend to think of as politics, but then politics is much, much broader than that. And I think it would be, ridiculous to say that history can, completely steer clear and being kind of pure of all this stuff. We deal with political issues when we study history. But I think there is an important distinction to make between historical questions and political and moral judgments that we might draw. And that's particularly important in the classroom when we're using public money to educate young people. That actually, for me, I think we need to keep a clear mind about this and a clear distinction between historical questions and the judgments that people might legitimately make using historical information or other material. I think there is a valid distinction to be made between those two things. But clearly, decisions to be made in history over, for example, what's studied in the curriculum very often will involve, political thinking and moral thinking and all sorts of other things going into that. But I think there's a distinction between making those decisions and being untruthful about the past, and it's that bothers me.
Right. And I think, that in some people's minds, there's a lot of controversy about maybe concerns and efforts to decolonize the curriculum. And I think in some people's view, I'm sure not in yours, Jonathan, but in some people's view, there's this idea that we need to not teach traditional history, but instead put those marginalized groups who've been whitewashed out of history front and center. And the concern might be that somehow distorts the study of the subject. And then maybe, maybe it'd be interesting if you could, respond to the idea of what the idea of decolonizing the curriculum might mean to you. But I think that some people might view it as actually that these groups have been marginalized, they have been taken out of history, and it's not about removing the traditional history that's taught, it's about making sure that we acknowledge that there were a diversity of voices and opinions and people involved throughout history. Does that sit, I don't know, how does that sit with you?
Yeah, I think what you're describing there sits reasonably well with me. I think part of the problem with a lot of this stuff is terms mean different things to different people, and you've used the term, a decolonized curriculum. Well, what does that mean? And it means a variety of different things. So if what we're saying, I would have some qualms about a curriculum, a history curriculum, where we are saying the aim of this curriculum is to promote, let's say, anti-racism. Not because, clearly, not because I think anti-racism is a bad thing. I think it's perfectly reasonable for a school to say that, we are opposed to racism entirely, and racism is a bad thing, and that's,
of course,
part of bringing up young people with the right values and the values that we want to promote. However, we're talking here specifically about the history curriculum, and for me, the thing that bothers me a little bit about doing that is, as soon as we say the purpose of the history curriculum is to do something other than to teach good history and to develop a strong understanding of the past, there's a danger, I think, that it becomes distorted. And for me, that's important. So when I think, if we're talking about decolonization, when I think of decolonization, I think the term representative curriculum is a more helpful term to think about. And that I think it's entirely reasonable to say that the history curriculum should be a representative one. But again, what does that mean? Well, I think probably for me, it needs to represent a number of different things reasonably. And so one of those things would be that I think it's reasonable for kids going to a British state school funded by British taxpayers' money, that curriculum should in some sense represent the modern population of Britain. And that therefore, ethnic minority groups are a key part of the population of Britain. And I think it's reasonable, therefore, to include aspects of that in the history curriculum. Now, clearly, there are limits. We can't possibly, in the confines of, a maximum of 2 hours a week through Key Stage 3, let's say, in a secondary school, and if you're lucky, very often, we can't possibly do justice to every single, ethnic minority group in the country, and so on. There's a balance to be struck. But I think that's a reasonable starting point. I think it also needs to represent the communities in the past that it studies. So if we are, studying 18th century Britain, well, Black history plays a very key role in that. And, the history of the slave trade and Britain's relationships with the colonies and so on, where slavery is central to the economy there and central to Britain's economy, that's a major part of Britain's story. So in a sense, I think if we miss that, we are not representing the past accurately. So it's representative of past communities. But I think the other thing it needs to be representative of is representative of the historical discipline, which again is an ill-defined thing. But, disciplined historical study, shall we say, isn't just about the kings and queens and the Battle of Hastings and so on. It's very broad, and this is not just about kind of Black history or history of different ethnic groups. There's all sorts of things in there. Gender is a huge issue, whether that be women's history, whether that be different religious groups. There's all sorts of things in there. People, queer history and so on. All sorts of things there, which are represented very strongly in the historical discipline today. Not to idolize that, there's probably a way for that to go too. But I think largely, certainly in my experience as a history teacher, those elements of the historical discipline are not very well represented in school curricula. And so I think there's work to do in terms of making it representative, but that I would still stand by the idea that is very different from saying there's a certain conclusion that we need to draw. This is what our history curriculum needs to teach students. They need to come away from this feeling that Britain was great, or feeling something in particular. we need to be doing a good job of teaching kids about the past and teaching kids history. And I think within that, it's perfectly reasonable to say, what should we be representing without telling the students what conclusions they have to draw?
Yeah, that's interesting, because certainly when I was at school studying history, we didn't study anything to do with the British Empire. And I think there was perhaps a period where we as educators maybe felt quite ashamed about Britain's role in the world. And rather than examining that, we just avoided it. And that some people might argue that now it's a particularly apposite time to teach the British Empire in all its faults, with all the things that it did which may be positive, but there's lots of much more negative stories out there which many people will be familiar with. And that if we try and give an honest appraisal, this happened, these things that this tiny island went out and sort of felt they had the right to govern the lives of people on all sorts of different continents. And I think maybe that helps explain to students in schools who might not feel represented by the curriculum, might feel, everyone around, the history they're learning about seems to be disproportionately white. It might help explain, how did my family come to this country? It might sort of provide the context to make that link, as long as we are suitably critical of Britain's role in world history. Or does that seem like a sensible option to you, Jonathan?
Yes, I think so. I think, history acting in some sense as a mirror can be very empowering for people. And so, I don't come from an ethnic minority background. I come from a white British background. But for me, when, there were aspects of my sort of family background and so on, that when I remember coming across things in history that kind of resonated with me, that was extremely empowering, and kind of I wanted to know more about them. And it kind of went beyond just, I've got an essay to do, I need to hand it in. And it became something that I just wanted to know about, because that was empowering and interesting and fascinating, and I kind of lapped it up and couldn't know enough. And that's a good thing. And where we can do that in the curriculum, that's lovely. I would stress again, the constraints are quite extreme, and we can't possibly ensure that everybody can look in a mirror and see their own kind of past, if you like, in the curriculum. And I think we also need to be careful that, it's lovely that I had that experience, that's great, and that had quite a profound impact on me as a person, but I would still draw a distinction between saying, I'm not convinced that was the purpose of the history study that was made available to me. The fact that that it had that impact, that's great and it's lovely, and it may well do that, but it's still valid historical study, regardless of whether it sort of provides that kind of personally empowering experience. So definitely, that I've lost my thread now. You asked me the second part of that question. I forgot now what it was, but I think that's lovely where it happens, but it doesn't always happen, and that doesn't make the history bad if a person isn't represented in it.
Jonathan, I think that was very clear. I think we've come to, we've navigated through some tricky waters there, and I hope that people watching this will, feel that they're able to contribute to an ongoing discussion. And if anyone out there wants to argue against Jonathan's position, we'd love to hear from you and see what you've got to say. But thanks ever so much, Jonathan, for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You may think